Dr. Ashley, just before we broke, we were talking about priorities and the prioritization of upgrading Iona. And in terms of the upgrade to Iona, with respect to priority, where would you place that on your priority list? Is there something that you would give a higher priority to from a Fraser Sockeye perspective?
I would put upgrades to Iona and Anasis and Lulu all on the same priority, because one deals with their freshwater riverine habitat, and the other one deals with the marine habitat, and that's the complexity of dealing with anadromous salmon, as they spend part of their life history in freshwater and part in the marine environment, and so you have to deal with both.
Okay. Following the Fraser report, there was a recommendation made with respect to upgrade to Anasis, and it has, in comparatively speaking, relatively recent times, been upgraded to the trickling filter secondary. Is that correct?
Yes, it went from a primary plant to a secondary plant of the trickling filter solids contact design.
Okay. Is there an easy fix to address your ammonia concern, or is this a substantial undertaking that you're proposing?
It would be a substantial undertaking.
And can you give us any sense of the magnitude in terms of cost?
Yeah, tens of millions.
Could we just have a moment, Mr. Commissioner? We have our tab 10 of our listed documents up, please. Dr. Ashley, this is Metro Vancouver's recently approved new liquid waste management plan. Have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
Okay, that could be the next exhibit, Mr. Commissioner.
Exhibit 1049.
The liquid waste management plan was accomplished by way of a letter dated May 30th at our tab 29. If we could zoom in on the paragraph with the number 1 at the start of it, please. And if this could be the next exhibit.
1050.
Dr. Ashley, you're aware that liquid waste management plans are typically approved by the province of British Columbia, and that those approvals sometimes carry with them conditions?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And the first condition on this letter is that the ministry supports the upgrading to secondary level treatment, the Lionsgate wastewater treatment plant by 2020, and Iona Island wastewater treatment plant as soon as possible, but no later than 2030. I wonder if you have any comments on the proposed timing and extent of the upgrades which are being suggested for those two treatment plants.
I agree with what the Metro reference panel in their original submission to Metro argued, is that both plants be done simultaneously and that they be upgraded to best available technology, which was considerably beyond secondary treatment.
And Dr. Ross, do you agree with that?
I think this would be largely outside my realm of expertise, but certainly if one is to design something to reduce risk associated with discharge of deleterious substances, upgrades to both these plants sooner rather than later would be of net benefit to salmon habitat.
All right. Now, Dr. Ashley, Metro Vancouver engages in a fairly substantial planning process associated with liquid waste that gets articulated through the liquid waste management plan. Is that, and that approach is not taken in all municipalities. Is the liquid waste management planning process one which you believe is beneficial?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And part of that process includes Metro Vancouver engaging in environmental monitoring, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And we're going to hear something about the environmental monitoring program in evidence tomorrow. But is it a program that you're familiar with?
Yes, I am.
Metro Vancouver? And you're familiar with the new liquid waste management plan, which proposes the continuation of that?
Yes.
I wonder if you have any comments on Metro Vancouver's environmental monitoring program?
Current or projected new?
Either one.
The existing...
Perhaps focusing on the projected new.
The projected, if you could you scroll down to the clauses in here?
Yes, certainly. If we, I think you're referring to conditions 5 and 6 of
yes.
the approval, and perhaps you could just highlight 5 and 6 for Dr. Ashley.
Is that there's recognition by the province who issues the permit for the approval for liquid waste management plan, is that they are also become concerned about the emerging chemical concern that Dr. Ross spoke about, that persistent organic pollutants, PVDs, that are accumulating at an alarming rate in Georgia Strait and off the or the marine outlet is for Iona, and also for the concern about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so it needs to build upon studies so that that becomes a larger component of of their monitoring programs.
In terms of conducting environmental monitoring, if one is concerned about Fraser sockeye, is it important for environmental monitoring to include the examination of pelagic species or salmon specifically, in your opinion?
Yes, I believe it is important.
Dr. Ross, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, if one were concerned about the real world out there in the natural environment, real habitat, real species, then I would suggest that that is the case, particularly with salmon. 96-hour LC50s, lethal concentration 50 tests in a laboratory with rainbow trout under very strict conditions will provide ease in terms of monitoring for effects. But it does not necessarily do anything more than document risks associated with acute, immediate effects. And that's where I think when one looks at the cumulative effects in the real world, as well as the long-term endocrine disrupting effects, that is, effects on the immune system, effects on behavior, effects on the ability of salmon to smell, and effects on normal growth and development. I think we could go a long way to having a better understanding of the nature of the many pollutants that end up in Fraser River sockeye habitat by expanding beyond the laboratory testing procedures currently called for.
You know, Mr. Commissioner, this letter references back to the 2002 Liquid Waste Management Plan, which is at our list of documents, number 11. We could bring that up. Dr. Ashley, you're familiar with this. This is the 2002 approved Liquid
Yes,
Waste
I am.
Management Plan. And in fact, it'd be the next exhibit. And
1051.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, just for your benefit, the approval letter is contained within this exhibit. One exhibit contains both of those documents, the plan and the approval letter. Dr. Ashley, under the 2001 drafted and 2002 approved Liquid Waste Management Plan, Metro Vancouver set up an environmental monitoring committee. You're familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And the terms of reference for that, I think the Commissioner is going to hear tomorrow, contemplated participation from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Environment Canada. Do you, from your experience working with Metro Vancouver and working in this area, do you believe the participation of those two agencies in a Metro Vancouver Environmental Monitoring Committee would be beneficial?
Yes, it would be beneficial.
Okay, and Dr. Ross? You have some experience with respect to involvement in monitoring of the Capital Regional District's wastewater. Can you offer an opinion as to whether the involvement of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans can be beneficial in monitoring wastewater matters?
Well, I think certainly having expertise regarding a life history of salmon or some of the other creatures that live or transit the receiving waters in the Fraser Estuary, Burrard Inlet, Strait of Georgia would be beneficial. I can't really comment as to whether that should be carried out by Fisheries and Oceans or not, but certainly there are a number of candidate experts within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, both within our habitat sector as well as our science sector, that I think would have some important expertise to contribute to such a committee.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Ashley, I wonder if you could just briefly explain to the Commissioner, I'm going to turn to a different topic now, the topic of combined sewer overflows, and I wonder if you could just explain to the Commissioner the manner in which, just briefly, the manner in which the sanitary and stormwater systems are designed presently in Vancouver and New Westminster, and how combined sewer overflow events can occur.
In many parts of the world that are 100+ years old, which is certainly New Westminster and parts of Vancouver, the sewers were storm sewers were combined into the sanitary sewer, and so they were designed under dry weather flow to just send the sewage to a sewage treatment plant. And when it rains above a certain intensity and for a certain duration, then the capacity of the sewage treatment plant to handle that additional rainwater runoff combined with the base flow of sewage means that the system then goes into an overflow mode, and that's what's known as a combined sewer overflow. It's different from a sanitary sewer overflow, which is just a sort of failure of the sanitary sewer system due to a pump failure or a pipe break or something like that may cause an overflow of raw sewage.
Okay, and the combined sewer overflows, do they result in sewage which has not been treated at all being released into the environment?
Yes, it's raw sewage and all of the other contaminants that come off the urbanized landscape.
Okay. And to the extent these combined sewers may be discharging into the Fraser River, is there a potential harm to Fraser Sockeye?
It would depend on the timing and the magnitude of the event. Theoretically, there would be a potential risk. You'd have to look at it on a risk-specific event. For acute toxicity, certainly for chronic toxicity and accumulation of persistent contaminants in the Fraser River, and which would then be sediment mobilized down into the estuary, there is a concern.
What measures are generally needed with respect to? I take it as Vancouver and New Westminster are the primary areas of concern.
For Fraser River or for combined sewer overflows in general?
For Fraser River.
For Fraser River, it's Vancouver and New Westminster.
Okay. And what measures are needed to minimize or mitigate the threats posed by combined sewer overflows?
There's a long-term plan to separate them, which generally rolls at the rate of 1 to 1.5% of the sewage system per year is replaced, and that's the separation rate, unless there is a higher priority that gets added on top of that normal replacement rate.
Okay. And that approach is already underway?
Yes, that approach has been underway for some time.
Okay. And do you support that approach to managing this issue?
Yes, I do. That deals with Metro's combined sewer overflows, and the city of New Westminster has its own replacement rate that needs to be looked at relative to their civic budget, and so it's important to distinguish between Metro Vancouver combined sewer overflows and then individual overflows that are owned by the respective municipalities.
Thank you. Dr. Ross, do you have anything to add to the issue of combined sewer overflows?
Well, I think Dr. Ashley summarized some of the concerns and certainly the technology or lack thereof with regard to CSOs. I do know from research that has been carried out in Puget Sound, Washington State, that CSOs and or some of the runoff associated with city streets have created problems for salmon. We know that copper is a metal that is very, very toxic. Copper is something that's released through brake pads and some other activities from vehicles. Salmon are extremely sensitive to copper, and there are acute sporadic mortalities associated with stormwater and CSO discharge. So separating out the storm sewers and the sanitary sewers is something that would help manage and reduce the release of some of the contaminants of particular concern. Stormwater as well. There are changes to stormwater systems that are fairly elementary that would also help to reduce the release of oils or suspended solids, etc. So even if one separates the combined into sewage stream and storm sewer discharge, there are means of further refining and reducing the release of various contaminants of concern to salmon.
Dr. Ross, I'm bringing up the 1994 Fraser report. It's a document you're somewhat familiar with?
Yes, very basically.
Okay. I'm going to ask that we turn, please, to page 70 of the document, and I'm looking at the page numbers in the bottom center. And if you could highlight recommendation 29, please. Dr. Ross and Mr. Van Agelen, I'm going to address this question to the two of you. There's a recommendation here made in 1995, I believe. We recommend that the federal, provincial, and local governments join forces to develop effective policies and plans in the Fraser River Basin designed to better treat and control the discharge of effluent into the Fraser River watershed. With bearing in mind that today's topic is focused primarily on municipal wastewater, I wonder if you can address the Commissioner on whether that has taken place.
1994, that comes out of the era of grave concerns about the release of dioxins and furans associated with pulp and paper mills, and those regulations were implemented in the early 1990s. So there would have been action at the time captured at the time of this Fraser report, wherein we would have seen upwards of 95% reduction in the release of dioxins and furans to the Strait of Georgia because of pulp mill contamination. There would probably be, this, I should point out, this precedes my time in British Columbia. I arrived in 1996, so I would rely on colleagues and publications predating my time here. And there certainly were staff and programs at our water quality unit, at our the Fisheries and Oceans Canada Water Quality Unit Habitat branch that would have been very much aware of some of the practices and oversight of the discharge of effluent of different types into the Fraser River system. Unfortunately, those colleagues, the water quality unit was disbanded in 2005, so we no longer have access to that expertise or that oversight, and it kind of makes it difficult for me to interpret with great rigidity the whether this has taken place or not. I think there are a number of things that have happened, a number of good things that have happened, a number of priority contaminants have been identified and reduced. There have been some upgrades to discharge processes for pulp and paper mills and some municipal plants, and there have been some ancillary or resulting improvements in the quality of habitat for some chemicals and for some types of activities. On the other hand, there have been some things that have gotten worse. A number of currently used pesticides are widely used in municipalities, agricultural areas, forestry lands. A number of chemicals, particularly flame retardant chemicals, have been increasing rapidly in the receiving waters of the Fraser Estuary. And I think what I'm trying to do is touch on a few points where I do have some awareness.
Yes.
But I'm unaware of a joining of forces to develop effective policies and plans for the Fraser River Basin.
Mr. Van Aagelen, do you have anything to add to that answer?
The only thing I might add to that, not specifically related to policies, is that I believe at that time the Fraser River Action Plan was in place, and I know that there was certainly some degree of activity with Environment Canada looking at water quality along the Fraser at that time.
Thank you. And if we could turn to the next page, please, Mr. Lennon, and highlight recommendation 30. And there's one here that, one of these sub-bullets that I think is particularly relevant, and I want to ask you about it, Dr. Ross. We recommend that DFO conduct further research on the effect of multiple sublethal stressors on migrating salmon. I wonder if you can address the Commissioner on the extent to which this recommendation has been addressed by the Department.
Well, several of these bullets are outside the purview of my expertise, but I do have colleagues that have worked extensively over the last couple of decades within.
I'm pointing you specifically to the third bullet.
The third bullet.
Yes.
I am aware of colleagues of mine that are looking at multiple stresses on migratory salmon, but these would not include contaminants or pollution-related stresses.
And are they doing it within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, this research?
Yes.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying.
Well, I was just implying or inferring or stating that there's very little in the way of sublethal stresses, research-related sublethal stresses from a contaminant perspective. And I think of note here is that in the old days, we used to view chemicals as being acutely lethal. We would see fish kills. We would see belly-up fish. We might have thousands of fish out there in a lake or river system, and that would be associated with an acute release of a toxic contaminant that would be present at a concentration high enough to kill fish. The problem is that as we have improved our understanding of what causes acute mortality, the numbers of chemicals that we consider to be to affect fish in a sublethal manner has been increasing exponentially. I mentioned the 23,000 chemicals on the domestic substances list. Many of these chemicals don't kill fish outright and would not necessarily, their toxicity would not be captured by a 96-hour LC50 experimental test, but they might reduce their growth, confuse them, affect their ability to smell, to find their home stream, reduce their immune system, make them vulnerable to disease, outbreaks of disease, or affect their energetics, in other words, their ability to feed and grow, etc. So often, sublethal effects of contaminants may not be evident, but when a secondary insult comes along, like a virus, like climate change, like a food supply problem, or other stress with regard to habitat destruction, that's where the contaminant influence may become a very significant contributing factor. In other words, the contaminants would predispose salmon to a secondary insult. And so I think in that sense it's very important to have contaminant research placed in the guise of the real world, of salmon habitat, of salmon life history, and understand how these contaminant stresses, which are out there, are contributing to population level impacts. And I would say that's not happening.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Commissioner, those are my questions for the panel. I believe Mr. East will be next for the Government of Canada.
Mr. Commissioner, Mark East for the Government of Canada. I'm with my colleague Geneva Grande McNeil for the Government of Canada. I will be no more than, I would think, 20-25 minutes. So probably 12-20, I hope. I just have a few questions for the panel, and maybe I'd like to start perhaps with just a big open-ended one. And maybe to start, just as a platform, we could go to Exhibit 633. And this is the article, Dr. Ross, maybe I'll start with you, that you published in 2002. And if we could go to... Did you say 633? Sorry, did I... It's tab 20.
I believe it's 833.
Sorry, 833, thank you. It's page 21, page 33 of Ringtail. Page 33 of Ringtail thing. So under summary, and the first sentence talks about the percentage of the municipal population as of 1999 in the Georgia Basin. 55% was served by sewage systems that had either secondary or tertiary treatment, representing a substantial increase from less than 20% prior to 1999. And I'm interested in the second line. This change likely improved some effluent quality characteristics such as BOD, TSS, and regulated contaminants, such as heavy metals, some pHs, PCBs, etc. So just stopping there, are these what we would call the traditional legacy contaminants that we've been talking about today?
Legacy contaminants in my world tend to be ones that have been regulated. Okay. So PCBs were regulated in 1977 in Canada. Dioxins and furans are a byproduct of human activities. They're byproduction largely through controls on the use of liquid chlorine at the pulp and paper in the pulp and paper sector. Those regulations were 1989, I believe, might have been a year or two later. So legacy contaminants are ones that we've largely addressed from a regulatory standpoint, but they're termed legacy because they're so persistent. In fact, PCBs, even though they've been banned for 35 years, they continue to represent a dominant concern at the top of aquatic food webs, for example, because the persistence, they're fat soluble, they get into these animals, they biomagnify, and they can affect animals through influencing their endocrine system. So that would be legacy contaminants. And then perhaps the other term that would be used for biological oxygen demand or suspended solids would be more, that'd be more lines of conventional pollutants that are typically associated with a history by humankind to reduce the impacts associated with human wastes.
Okay, thank you. And that's an important distinction to make, and I appreciate that. What I would like to do is maybe just focus a little bit on the conventional, traditional contaminants, and then much of the discussion we've had this morning, I think rightly so, has been on the new emerging, persistent, bioaccumulative and toxic contaminants. But I just want to ask a couple questions about the traditional, conventional contaminants. Would it be fair to say, remembering that we're here to discuss potential impacts on Fraser River sockeye salmon, that because of the improvements in water quality, municipal wastewater treatment and other improvements, that we are less concerned about the traditional contaminants as a primary cause for the decline of the Fraser River sockeye salmon? emphasis on the traditional and conventional contaminants. Maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Ross, and then ask the other members of the panel.
Well, I would start by saying that wastewater treatment plants are designed by and large to deal with conventional parameters and pollutants, so that in upgrading, I think I'd have to defer to my colleague Dr. Ashley, but the upgrades typically will address and mitigate for those types of conventional pollutants. Unfortunately, we have many thousands of chemicals that are in the wastewater stream that are only that may or may not be addressed through upgrades. Many of them are reduced in terms of they're retained through upgraded processes, but they may not break down. They may still represent a problem at some point, depending on what happens to the application of the biosolids. So I think I would concur with your line of questioning, in the sense that we are more concerned today about many of the compounds for which we have a fairly cursory understanding of their toxicity and a fairly elementary understanding of their response to upgrades in levels of sewage treatment. The upgrades to sewage treatment are typically not designed because of some of these new and emerging contaminants. It's only by happenstance or by good luck that many of these chemicals are removed from the wastewater stream through upgraded treatment.
Dr. Ashley?
The question being, do I agree with that statement?
That the traditional and conventional contaminants are now less of a concern, increasingly perhaps less of a concern, with the upgrades that we've talked about as a primary cause for the decline of Fraser River sockeye salmon.
I think some of the conventionals, as it states there, VOD5 and TSS, are generally well treated by conventional secondary treatment plants. And as we discussed earlier, the type of secondary treatment plant can have a large effect on other chemicals which are also lumped into the conventional category, namely nitrogen and phosphorus. And so the nitrogen's in the form of ammonia. We've discussed about the ammonia toxicity issue, and the fact that phosphorus is also discharged through with no control on any of these plants. And whether that leads to increases in algal productivity in the lower sections of the river and the marine environment, we all know there's a growing concern about marine dead zones and estuaries around the world. And so conventional treatment of secondary treatment plants of those conventional contaminants has not done anything.
Okay. Mr. Van Hagelen, do you have anything to add to that question?
The only rider is that as long as the plant is running at peak efficiency, because as long as the BOD, biological oxygen demand and chemical oxygen demand and suspended solids are kept in check, then the effluent quality should be sufficient to sustain life and on a short-term exposure. But if BOD and COD are not maintained properly, you will have effluents deficient in dissolved oxygen and still result in quote conventional toxicity. So the two have to go forward together. In other words, for an upgrade to a plant, that BOD quality in addition to upgrades has to be maintained as well.
Okay, thank you. I may just continue on this theme, but I'd like to get back to the issue of some of the engineering and cost issues in a few minutes, but I want to maybe go to tab 3 of the Commission's list of documents. And it's CAN 025061. This is an Environment Canada document, so maybe I'll ask you, Mr. Van Hagelen, if you recognize this document, a public document, a state of municipal wastewater effluents in Canada. Are you familiar with that? Have you seen this document before?
Only since the exhibits were sent to me.
Okay. Perhaps I can ask Dr. Ashley, Dr. Ross, if this is something that you've ever seen or been part of or reviewed before.
No, I haven't.
Just as an exhibit.
Okay. I'd like to go to, just ask you some, just use this as a platform for some questions. Maybe go to page 29 in Ringtail. And I'm interested in the heading that talks about the assimilative capacity of the receiving water. And I just want to understand, how this works and why this is an important factor. And it says here, the volume and flow of receiving water will determine its ability to dilute or assimilate effluent discharges, and hence the extent of toxic effects occurring in the vicinity of the discharge. Although a concentrated effluent may be highly lethal in laboratory tests, receiving systems with a large assimilative capacity may dilute the effluent to the point where it is no longer deadly. However, in small water courses, intertidal areas or receiving waters that are subject to periodically low seasonal flows, the water volume may be insufficient to dilute the effluents to non-toxic levels. And I think this is something, Dr. Ashley, you touched on, especially with respect to the lower Fraser River. What is the nature of the assimilative capacity of this area, especially in the intertidal zone? Is this something that essentially, when these discharges go out, that they are diluting efficiently, or is there characteristics about this area that we should be concerned about?
Well, the concept of dilution is sort of central to any effluent discharge, and so all of these plants are designed with the dilution of the receiving environment to the effluent in order to theoretically get to non-toxic concentration. So it meets the provincial water quality objectives. And as I said earlier, that over a 24-hour period, the dilution could be fine, but because the Fraser is a tidal system, it has at least 4 slack water periods per day where dilution may be substantially less than what is required. And so at that point, you may not be getting the required dilution on an instantaneous rate. And if fish are exposed to that, the fish might argue that although the 24-hour dilution rate's fine, the instantaneous dilution rate that they experience at say low slack tide in the winter when concentrations are low may not be appropriate. The other concept is that traditional engineering taught that the solution to pollution is dilution. That was the old sort of mantra that was taught in engineering school through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, with the general belief that the type of pollutants that were in wastewater treatment plants could be diluted down to a certain point where they became a non-issue. And that was certainly the argument that City of Victoria used for decades. With the recent knowledge of the type of persistent chemicals that Dr. Ross and Van Egelen have discussed, you may dilute it 1 million times in the receiving environment, but if the bioconcentration by trophic processes reconcentrates that 1 million times, then basically it's a zero-sum game. And so the solution to pollution is no longer effective when you're dealing with persistent contaminants that biomagnify.
And maybe a follow-up question on this to Mr. Van Egelen about the acute lethality test. With respect to testing or monitoring the effluent at some of these wastewater treatment plants, I take it they take what you call a cocktail, I suppose, of directly from the municipal wastewater treatment plant, and they test it in a laboratory setting using the LC50 test. Is that how that is done?
That's correct. The regulatory test for measuring end of pipe discharge is you take the end of pipe discharge before it enters into waters frequented by fish. It's brought back to the laboratory and it's tested to determine if greater than 60% of the fish die in 100% concentration over 96 hours. And if it passes that, it's in quote, compliance with both usually federal and provincial effluent quality guidelines. And the premise of and just following on what Dr. Ashley just said, is that the LC50 was determined that while it's not acutely toxic within the initial dilution zone, that outside of what they call the IDZ or initial dilution initial dilution zone for a given discharge point, that there would be no chronic toxicity either, based on, quote, the modeled assimilative capacity of the receiver.
And that's, I guess, as you talk about the model or the traditional view, is that the sockeye or whatever the fish is that's going to become in contact with that effluent, it's never going to come in contact with the effluent that you are necessarily testing in the lab.
That's at the test concentration in the lab. It's going to be exposed at some concentration within the receiver at X value.
Exactly. So that the fish is going to be swimming near the end of the pipe in a receiving environment that, first of all, I suppose, has many other contributing contaminants from other sources.
Correct.
And it also, the concentrations are diluted to, depending on innumerable factors, I suppose.
Correct.
I guess where I'm going with this is, how do you envision a monitoring, and then this an open-ended question, because I don't really know the answer to this, obviously. How do you envision a monitoring program for contaminants that's going to take into account the myriad of real-world effects and mixtures that sockeye salmon or other species are going to be swimming through?
In my view, if we know the various dilution concentrations or isopleths of concentration of effluent within a given reach of the river or creek or whatever, those concentrations can be tested in a laboratory with the material being discharged to determine if at those concentrations actually in the receiving environment at 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers downstream of the discharge are eliciting some type of effect. And again, this is where I believe that toxicogenomics, or looking at molecular signals as a consequence of exposure in the receiving environment, will give us value as to the health or protection of the species of fish.
Just following on this theme a little bit, and I wanted to ask a question about the cost of research and cost of testing. It's something we haven't really touched on. I'm just curious as to what it takes as far as the economics and the cost of doing testing for each sample in your lab. Can you give us a sense of what's entailed, I guess, economically with respect to testing, just so we have a sense of what it costs to implement a research or lab testing program?
If I could start with, because we've talked about traditional research methods, the conventional fish bioassay, or the 96-hour acute lethality test that we've talked about today, is a test that's been around since the 60s, and that in every provincial jurisdiction and a lot of private consultants actually can do and provide this service, and the test is well established. It's an accredited test by the federal government, and there's also private accreditation bodies that actually will go out and certify private labs and government labs to say that they can do this test. So the conventional fish bioassay, to set a test up, to set a laboratory up is expensive. It's expensive to keep fish in husbandry, but the actual cost of doing the test for a client can range from most probably $200 to maybe $700 for an acute lethality test. With respect to toxicogenomics, as we talked about today, it's an emerging field of aquatic toxicology, and consequently there is, as with any new field, there's, other than our lab in North Vancouver, I'm not, and maybe some other academic labs at UBC and perhaps at Simon Fraser and U of Vic, that I'm not fully aware that there's that much availability to do that. And so it's as with any new emerging science or emerging method, the costs are quite high. But with respect to genomics, the cost is decreasing because a lot of the methods and techniques we use are coming out of the human health science. So we essentially adopt or modify methods that they use in human or cancer research with respect to genomics and adopt them to my lab. So to set up a genomic program, I would say the cost is quite dear. It's very expensive because it's a lot of statistical evaluations. There's highly trained individuals that have to be hired. It's not as straight forward as a conventional fish bioassay where the fish are either alive or dead. So there's no interpretation there. Opposed to with genomics, there's a lot of molecular and biochemical analysis that has to be done to look at gene profiles and linking gene profiles to pathways of adversity, and then arriving at to the conclusion that those genomic signals that we see are capable or were capable of causing some type of harm, whether swimming impairment, sometimes, for example, if the insulin receptors were high. The receptors are associated with sight. So if the fish has got elevated insulin receptors, the fish could be blind. So it may look fine, but obviously sight to navigate or sight to flee from a predator, that fish would be picked off and not be a contributor to the population. So those, to get back to your original question, the cost, I believe, is coming down, but to set the programs up are very expensive.
And I guess where I'm going with this is, do you have the funding, the money to do this kind of work right now?
No.
And bring this back to the big picture, and this is a kind of question for all the panel. In this hearing today, and I believe in some of the evidence in some of the other hearings, we've heard a lot of evidence about the different effects, contaminants and other sources, effects on Fraser River sockeye salmon. And for example, today we heard of a need to do more research into the effects, especially of new and emerging chemicals. We also heard some evidence about the costs of upgrading or building municipal wastewater treatment plants. Perhaps to a lesser extent, but I think inherent in the discussion of combined sewage outflows and stormwater drains, which appear to be a concern, there are capital costs, obviously, in fixing that problem. And then there are all the other issues, the problems that we've talked about in other hearing dates. All of these fixes cost money, and there is probably a finite budget. So I guess where I'm going with this, and maybe I'm just going to throw this to the panel to give your thoughts on this. With all these different demands for funding, as a question of priority, where would you recommend that this attention be paid first? And just as one other caveat, maybe as part of the answer, I heard maybe two different theories about municipal wastewater treatment. One is that we need to do more work to make sure we get it right, because if the money is spent, we just want to do it right the first time, versus we need to get these things put in place as soon as possible because of the impact on Fraser River sockeye salmon. Are these reconcilable views, and where should we be putting the money, the research, and the budgets that we have on these different factors? And I'll just leave it at that question for all three of you.
Being I've got the red light on, I'll weigh it in. I think, in my opinion, there's two things that we need to address. If we are going to continue to use Fisheries Act 36.3 as a, I guess, a sentinel for protection of Canada's water, and I think the science and our methods, our toxicological methods to gauge effluent quality at the end of the pipe, or have to be changed, or so our ability to determine that the amount of money or the engineering changes that we're putting into whatever upgrades, we have the ability as scientists or regulators to make sure that we have a gauge of understanding the effluent quality. As I say, the conventional fish bioassay, that was served us well for, almost 60, 70 years as a gauge of measuring effluent quality. As we enter into a new era of emerging chemicals and contaminants of concern that we know are eliciting effects on populations, that we as scientists, and again as regulators, must have the tools to ensure that the environment is protected. And as I say, whether it's genomics or metabolomics or omic technologies, that's kind of where we are right now. But in the future, 20 years from now, we may have other methods of measuring effluent quality. So yes, upgrading, but equal, if not same amount of fiscal money put towards the scientific authorities to make sure that they have the tools with which we can gauge improvements or potential impacts on the receiving environment.
Yeah, I would simply build on that by saying that I think actually science can be very cost effective. Certainly I have a bit of a vested interest here because I rely on research dollars for the work that I do. But in the past we've had access to budgets where we come up with an idea because of our sort of expert understanding of the literature and some of the hot topics that have emerged from other parts of the world. Between 1945 and 1990, not a single lake trout reproduced in Lake Ontario. And for decades, government agencies were cutting back on fish permits and quotas, had a huge, very expensive lamprey control program. We're trying to figure out what was going on. And it wasn't until some fairly good detective work by a team of researchers discovered that dioxin levels in the sediments and in the eggs were lethal for 4.5 decades. And that took science work, and that took one set of scientists to uncover that story and to demonstrate that dioxins were present in a concentration that were unacceptable, and it led to population level crash. In the case of the Maritimes, the aerial application of spruce budworm pesticide called aminocarb through the 80s and 90s led to a near collapse of Atlantic salmon returns for 13 salmon watersheds, and that was related to not the aminocarb but its carrier compound, which is nonylphenol. It's one of these nasty estrogenic compounds. And again, it was a creative, smart guy, Wayne Fairchild, who did the statistics comparing the aerial application of this pesticide to forests with looking at escapement or the returns of these salmon, and then subsequently some lab-based research to show that a single chemical was leading to the loss of millions of Atlantic salmon. Acid rain, fairly simple process, but devastated tens of thousands of lakes back east. And notably, in those cases, salmonids were much more sensitive than perch or some of the other species. So lake trout ceases to reproduce below about a pH of 5.7. So as soon as lakes got a little bit acidified, lake trout stopped reproducing. So I would say that science can be very efficient, very cost-effective, and I think very important in terms of providing insight that is useful from a management or regulatory policy perspective. But without that science, I think as Mr. Van Hagelin pointed out, without the science, we're not really knowing what we're doing if we are making difficult and expensive choices on upgrades. That said, in a lot of cases in the past, we've learned from our mistakes, and those mistakes were in the past. In other words, we thought DDT was a miracle pesticide. We thought PCBs, they were called the magic liquid by its creator. We were told CFCs were non-toxic, and yet they destroyed the Earth's ozone. We often learn these lessons the hard way and after the fact. Science can do as good a job as it possibly can and try to be precautious, but really science doesn't operate that way. It really operates on the basis of evidence from past experience or laboratory experience. So I would urge a little bit of precaution as well as a reliance on a weight of evidence, which is an accepted paradigm for human health, a weight of evidence approach, where we extrapolate from multiple lines of evidence to support the design of wastewater treatment plants that will reduce the risk for many compounds we're worried about, and for other compounds for which we know nothing, but may become a really big problem in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. Maybe, Dr. Ash, I'll leave the last word with you.
Yeah, I think there was 3 questions there. Where does the money come from? Scheduling and build now or later. To sum it up?
Yes.
Number 1, where's the money come from? Obviously, it comes from taxpayers, whether it's provincial, federal, or in the municipal or metro area. And that's who ultimately pays for these things, and that's the cost of protecting the environment. I mean, for years we've sort of been living in a the Auditor General has reported on the sorry state of infrastructure in Canada, whether it's bridges or wastewater treatment plants or whatever, and that's partly what some of the CCME guidelines are to do, is to bring up some of these preliminary and primary plants up to secondary standards. So that's essentially the cost of doing business, particularly in BC, because of the presence of iconic species like salmon and orcas. I think it's even more important that that's done, and because I think most people in this province like to see those species around. And if you ask them how many extra dollars would you like to pay a year so that you see salmon in the Fraser River or you see orcas in George Strait, most people would be on side with that. So basically it's the cost of doing business if you want to live in a clean environment. The second question was about scheduling and do what? The recommendation from the reference panel was that both Iona and the Lionsgate proceed in tandem, and basically because they're going from a relatively crude primary state, and they recommended they went to advanced wastewater treatment, which is tertiary or plus. And basically they could be done simultaneously if the amortization period to pay for the plants was extended from the 15-year period, which is shown in the charts, which is cost prohibitive, out to a longer period. And the Metro Finance Committee had considerable deliberations on that and decided for some strange reason they wanted to stick to a 15-year amortization period. And that's puzzling when you realize that some of the big infrastructure projects that humans use, like bridges, like wastewater treatment plants, are intergenerational, and so they're used by 2 or 3 generations. They have a 50, 60, 75-year lifespan. That it would seem reasonable to have those paid out, amortized over a period that was consistent with their intergenerational services they provide, rather than trying to pay it off quickly and inflating the price to the point you say it can't be done. So things have to be done serially rather than sequentially. And the last point was to build now or later. And I guess that's considering that you sit around and wait for some technology to come along 5-10 years from now, and so you maintain the existing technology at Lionsgate and Iona. There's best available technology now that is quite sufficient, that is robust enough that the future regulations which will come out of CCME, because CCME, might remind you, is still white paper, and there's tens of millions of dollars of research being done around the world by environmental engineers, civil engineers, on how to remove these contaminants. And so if you pick the right design that has the right sort of configuration, the add-ons that will deal with these emerging contaminants can be added on fairly reasonably as compared to building the wrong type of design up front, which makes it very expensive to retrofit, as is the case of Anisis.
Thank you very much, and those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to suggest we break for lunch.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.